open the gate. My guests will be using the shortcut." Her voice carried no hint of courtesy, only command. The problem was simple. That gate stood on my land, with my name etched on the deed. Yet here Patricia Blackwood, the ever-imposing HOA president, acted as though I was the trespasser. Behind her, the Tesla purred softly, its air conditioning whispering while she stared at me from behind her designer sunglasses. For a brief moment, I wondered what she'd try: a fire, a fusillade, fines, intimidation, a broken bar, perhaps something worse. I turned the key anyway, heard the lock shift, and murmured, "Not today." Her practiced smile faltered, and that was the moment everything began to ignite. "Would you have opened it? Tell me in the comments." The late July sun scattered across the lake like splintered crystal, each glint skimming the surface in a dozen directions. I stood beside the iron gate of my cabin, keys resting in my palm, watching the sleek black Model X easing to a halt at the entrance of my private drive. For an instant, only the soft pulse of water against the dock and the lonely call of a loon broke the silence. Then came the sharp, impatient rhythm of heels on stone. Patricia stepped out, immaculate in a white blazer despite the heat, her expression taut with irritation. "Tell me where you're watching from. Have you ever dealt with someone like this, Mr. Warner?" Her voice cut through the space between USA, cold, clipped, authoritative. "I need you to open your gate." There was no request, no courtesy, just an assumption that I would obey. For 3 years I had endured Patricia's brand of leadership, ever since she schemed her way into the HOA presidency. But this was different. This wasn't about lawn rules or mailbox measurements. This was about my land, my sanctuary, the place I'd retreated to after 3 decades of federal service. I held the gate key firmly, its familiar metal weight grounding me. 20 years of investigating environmental abuses had taught me the power of steady composure. Patricia's posture radiated entitlement, his shoulders squared, chin lifted, one manicured hand on her hip while the other motioned irritably at the gate. Through the tinted glass of her Tesla, faint silhouettes shifted the well-dressed guests awaiting whatever spectacle she intended to create. "This is private property, Patricia," I said evenly. "Not a community shortcut." The words rolled out naturally. I'd spent a lifetime setting regulations to people convinced that rules were optional. Her eyes flashed with annoyance. "Don't start this, Clayton. My guests need a direct route to the marina, and your charming little gate is in the way. This is about being cooperative with the community, something you consistently struggle with." She stepped closer, her heels striking the stones with rehearsed precision. The marina sat at the end of the peninsula, reachable by boat or by the narrow strip of land running straight through my family's original homestead. Most residents used the longer public road, but Patricia had apparently decided her elite visitors were above such inconvenience. "Community guidelines clearly require residents to support access for approved events," she added, twisting interpretations into mandates with practiced ease. I almost laughed. Patricia excelled at reshaping rules to suit her desires, but what she failed to grasp was that federal property rights outweighed her curated rulebook. Through the cabin window, I could see the top corner of my filing cabinet, the one that held environmental compliance files, federal documents, and most importantly, the original 1892 homestead grant that had given the Warner family undisputed ownership of this land. "Patricia," I said, keeping my tone crisp and professional, the same voice I once used when briefing corporate executives violating the Clean Water Act. The easement law is very clear. Private property does not become public simply because it's convenient. Her face tightened. "You know what, Clayton, this attitude of yours is exactly what drags this community down. You hide behind your government background like it makes you superior, or like the rest of us should bow to your federal credentials." She gestured broadly toward the marina. "This is about being a good neighbor, about community values. But I guess 30 years of bureaucratic office work didn't teach you much about cooperation." The words struck their intended target, a bureaucratic office work, as if 3 decades of protecting watersheds, enforcing environmental law, and safeguarding public resources were somehow meaningless compared to her empire of HOA fees. Heat surged through my chest, tightening my jaw. I had spent a lifetime serving the public interest while Patricia spent hers cultivating influence and amplifying petty authority. The urge to remind her exactly what my so-called bureaucratic work had accomplished flared hot and immediate. I kept my mouth shut. 2 decades of federal investigations had taught me that the most effective response to arrogance was patience, not confrontation. I slipped a hand into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing the envelope I had carried for weeks containing copies of the federal water rights certificate my grandfather signed in 1923. Patricia's gaze followed the movement, and for a fleeting second, doubt passed through her expression. "Actually, Patricia," I said quietly, "my government career taught me a great deal about regulatory compliance and property law, including the difference between federal jurisdiction and local authority." I withdrew my hand empty, watching the relief return to her face as she realized I wasn't about to present any documents. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the shoreline in amber light. Inside the Tesla, her guests were beginning to stir with impatience. Patricia herself was starting to frown while shifting from one foot to the other as her confident Section 8 thinned. "Fine," she snapped at last, her tone stretched tight with restrained irritation. "Have it your way for tonight, Clayton, but this isn't finished. The community board will be informed, and I assure you your antisocial behavior will have repercussions." She spun sharply and strode back to her car, each step punctuated by indignation and bruised authority. When she reached the door, she paused, casting me a final look over her shoulder. "Emergency home meeting, Monday, 7 o'clock. I suggest you arrive with a more agreeable attitude." The warning was unmistakable, delivered with the certainty of someone who believed her title granted her absolute power over everyone else's life. The Tesla hummed to life. I watched the headlights glide across the trees as she backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the road. I remained there for several long moments, letting the quiet evening fold around me like an old, familiar coat. My hand drifted back to my pocket, the envelope still resting there with documents Patricia couldn't imagine existed. My grandfather, an Irish immigrant, had understood the importance of land, water rights, and meticulous record-keeping. He taught my father, who taught me, that knowing your rights was the first step in defending them. And after 30 years of federal environmental work, I understood rights and jurisdiction better than most. Patricia believed she was facing a simple neighborhood conflict, a stubborn homeowner who needed to be disciplined with community pressure. What she didn't realize was that she had just ignited a conflict with someone who had spent 30 years uncovering regulatory violations, someone fluent in the subtle hierarchy of federal, state, and local authority, someone who knew precisely which laws held more weight. Tomorrow, I would begin reminding Patricia Blackwood that federal water rights surpassed HOA bylaws every single time. But tonight, I walked back toward my cabin, pausing to gaze out over the marina where boats swayed gently in their slips, many owned by neighbors who had no idea their access to the water existed only because the Warner family allowed it. This was no longer just a dispute over a gate. This was about respect, legal boundaries, and teaching someone a costly lesson in federal law. 48 hours after Patricia's dramatic exit, I learned just how quickly community sentiment could be weaponized. My morning coffee was interrupted by a notification from the Lakeside Community Forum, an online group Patricia governed with the rigidity of a digital tyrant. Her post, timestamped 6:43 a.m., was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. Some neighbors seem to forget that we live as a community, not as isolated kingdoms. When basic courtesy and access for community guests become impossible, everyone suffers. Disappointing behavior from those we expect better from. By midday, the comment section had erupted. Helen Chambers, my neighbor of 15 years, wrote, "So frustrating when people put their personal priorities above community spirit." Margaret Foster added, "This is exactly why property values drop. Some people simply don't understand what it means to live in a quality neighborhood." By noon, the thread had accumulated 37 responses, most echoing Patricia's carefully crafted plea for cooperation from unnamed troublemakers. The irony was bitter. They were preaching community unity while participating in a digital mob rallied by the same woman who had tried to force access to land she didn't own. I shut the laptop and walked to my filing cabinet. I pulled out the folder I'd been studying ever since Patricia's visit. Inside were federal water rights documents dating back to 1923, environmental impact assessments, surveys, and correspondence with the Army Corps of Engineers. My grandfather's signature on the original certificate remained sharp and legibly a testament to his meticulous care. Patricia had been exercising authority she never actually possessed. By Wednesday afternoon, her online crusade had escalated into official paperwork. An envelope stamped with the whole letterhead appeared in my mailbox, containing a formal warning signed by Patricia in her role as president. The language was polished and strategically phrased, citing community bylaws on antisocial behavior and obstruction of community harmony. A $500 fine was proposed for what she described as my ongoing refusal to comply with reasonable community expectations. The letter demanded that I attend an emergency board meeting to explain my supposed pattern of unfavorable conduct. I read the notice twice, my investigative instincts instantly identifying every procedural flaw: no proper notice period, no formal hearing before imposing penalties, and no specific bylaw cited to justify any of the accusations. Patricia had ignored every due process requirement in her rush to punish me, creating a trail of violations that would unravel her case in any legitimate legal forum. The same woman who had spent 3 years preaching about proper procedures had abandoned them the second they got in her way. Thursday brought something more personal. My phone buzzed with a message from Tom Rodriguez, a neighbor I'd helped during last year's dock repairs. "Hey Clayton, heard about the gate situation. Kinda disappointed, man, thought you were better than that." More messages followed throughout the day, small betrayals generated by Patricia's narrative. She had transformed a simple boundary disagreement into a moral indictment of my character. Each text carried that told, familiar sting of the isolation that settles in when you choose to uphold rules rather than bend them for convenience. For the first time since this ordeal began, I questioned whether the fight was worth continuing. Then I glanced at the stack of documents on my desk and remembered exactly why I couldn't walk away. That evening, I called the County Water Authority and spoke with Jennifer Walsh, an environmental compliance officer I'd worked with during my federal tenure. "Clayton, good to hear from you," she said warmly. "What's going on?" I outlined the situation in general terms, avoiding names but focusing on jurisdictional issues. Jennifer's expertise confirmed what my research already suggested: the law was unquestionably in my favor, especially since the agreement Patricia relied on had quietly expired years earlier. I didn't need to wave statutes around to understand what that meant. Ownership doesn't disappear simply because someone chose to overlook a deadline. Years of investigative work had taught me that successful battles are won through precision and not power plays. Not noise, but by presenting evidence so clear that no one can dispute it. As I organized the county records that afternoon, my anger evaporated. All that remained was focus. I requested copies of the original community charter, the HOA bylaws, and every amendment filed since its creation. I cross-referenced Colorado HOA law with federal property regulations, building a foundation of legal precedent sturdy enough to withstand any argument Patricia intended to make. Sunday brought an unexpected knock. Helen Chambers arrived around noon, her expression uneasy yet resolute. "Clayton, I wanted to talk before the meeting tomorrow," she began, nervously turning her car keys in her hand. "Patricia's been a broken bar vocal. She's saying you've become difficult, that you're not the same neighbor you were 15 years ago." I invited her inside, curious to see how deeply Patricia's influence had seeped into the community. "She's prepared a presentation for the meeting," Helen continued, accepting a cup of coffee. "Something about community standards and what happens when personal interests override collective goodwill. She's got the board behind her, and honestly a broken bar most people are siding with her." I nodded. None of this surprised me. Patricia was an effective manipulator who understood how to shape narratives and control the flow of information. What she failed to grasp was that certain battles aren't won with charm or publicity, they're won with facts. "Helen, can I ask you something?" I said, settling across from her. "Do you know who actually owns the marina?" She blinked at me, Puzzled. Well, a broken bar the community, I guess. The home manages it, collects fees, handles the upkeep. Why? I smiled my first genuine smile since Wednesday. That's a reasonable assumption, I said. But tell me, broken bar, have you ever actually seen the ownership documents? She shook her head, uncertainty deepening. Well, Patricia handles all the administrative details. She's very thorough with community assets. After Helen left, I made up my mind. Patricia wanted a public showdown where she could flaunt her support and try to force my submission through social pressure. What she was going to receive instead was a lesson in federal property law and a demonstration of what occurs when outdated authority collides with actual ownership. I picked up my phone and typed a short message. I sent an email to the whole board requesting 10 minutes of meeting time to address a few property-related questions that had recently surfaced. I made no mention of marina ownership, water rights, federal jurisdiction, or outdated agreements. I simply asked for a chance to speak to the community about matters concerning the land. By Monday morning, Patricia replied with a curt email approving my request but cautioning that any form of disruption or defensive conduct would not be permitted. Her confidence was absolute, as so assured of her influence within the neighborhood that she couldn't imagine any scenario where I might hold a stronger position. Over the next several days, I collected everything I needed: copies of old filings, archived charters, and discreet comments from residents who were beginning to question her leadership. The weather shifted, and so did the neighborhood's atmosphere. As Monday's meeting drew near, Patricia remained blissfully unaware of how fragile her footing had become. She thought she was stepping into a confrontation with an obstinate neighbor. She was actually walking into an audit. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the basement archives of the County Historical Society, wearing white cotton gloves as I handled documents from the 1920s and 1930s. Dorothy, the elderly archivist and retired librarian, was eager to help trace the Warner family's land history back to the original federal grants. Your grandfather kept remarkably detailed records, she noted while carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound ledger from 1923. Most families from that era had long lost track of their documentation, yet he had preserved every scrap. The records confirmed an unbroken chain of Warner family ownership was something Patricia had either dismissed or never bothered to research. Sean Warner's federal homestead grant from 1892 covered 300 acres of lakefront land, including the natural harbor that later became the marina. He sold most of the property to developers in the 1960s but retained the water access points and riparian rights. The first home management agreement, drafted in 1968, granted a 20-year operational term while explicitly reserving full ownership for the Warner family. My father renewed that agreement in 1988 for another 20 years. When it expired in 2008, during Patricia's first year as president, no renewal was ever filed. For 5 years, Patricia assumed the management rights were permanent, collecting fees and making decisions about property she did not legally control. My investigation soon extended from property records to financial documentation. On Tuesday morning, I visited the office of Alexander Thornton, a soft-spoken attorney known for his meticulous preparation and deep knowledge of Colorado water law. His calculations suggested that nearly $50,000 in marina fees had been improperly collected since 2008. Patricia is making 3 major mistakes, he observed calmly: exercising authority she doesn't possess, using official communications for personal attacks, and asserting control over property that legally remains outside her jurisdiction. That afternoon, I received troubling news about Patricia's newest tactic. Helen Chambers called to warn me about coordinated phone efforts urging residents to attend Monday's meeting and defend community values. Patricia had recruited longtime residents to call their neighbors directly, framing my stance as a threat to property values and neighborhood stability. The sophistication of her influence campaign was impressive, if ethically questionable. "Clayton, she's telling people you're setting a dangerous precedent," Helen explained uneasily. "She's saying that if you're allowed to block access, others will start ignoring landscaping rules, architectural reviews of everything. She's making it sound like you're attacking the very idea of community standards. I thanked Helen and quietly noted how Patricia had twisted a straightforward property rights dispute into an existential crisis for neighborhood governance. Wednesday turned out to be my most productive day of research. With Dorothy's historical findings and Alexander's legal framework, I visited the regional office of the Army Corps of Engineers to review federal records tied to the lake's navigational classification. The lake had been designated as federally navigable waters in 1934, meaning any commercial operations required federal oversight, a oversight Patricia had never obtained. Environmental assessments were mandatory for modifications to marina operations, yet she had introduced new guest fees and expanded storage without filing a single review. By Thursday, Patricia escalated her campaign even further. The mail delivered her most audacious move yet, a formal notice of violation sent to every resident, listing my alleged antisocial behaviors and requesting community input. The notice outlined what Patricia described as the appropriate response to uncooperative neighbors. The document was formatted to perfection on official whole letterhead, giving it the kind of manufactured legitimacy that most residents would accept without question. In truth, Patricia had orchestrated a neighborhood tribunal, one in which she played prosecutor, judge, and executioner. Yet her increasingly aggressive tactics were beginning to cause internal friction. Gregory Stone, the calmest and most rational voice on the whole board, phoned me Thursday evening to express his discomfort. "Clayton, I want you to understand that not everyone agrees with the direction this is taking," he said carefully. "A number of us believe Patricia is overstepping, but she currently has enough backing to force through nearly anything." His call revealed the first visible fractures in Patricia's alliance, weak points that could be leveraged with a proper strategy. Friday delivered the last crucial element of my preparation, a comprehensive legal brief detailing every facet of the marina ownership issue. Alexander had helped construct the document to deliver maximum clarity and impact, beginning with straightforward property law principles and gradually progressing into the more intricate federal jurisdiction matters. The packet included copies of all pertinent material from Sean Warner's original homestead grant to Patricia's most recent violation notice, as of forming an unassailable record of ownership and authority. The strength of this method lies in its clarity, Alexander reminded me as we reviewed the final layout. "You're not attacking Patricia's character or intentions. You're presenting verified facts and asking the community to reconsider the assumptions they've accepted about marina management. Let the evidence speak." His approach matched my own training. Federal investigators win by assembling airtight documentation, not by indulging in personal disputes. The weekend passed quietly, allowing me to organize my presentation and prepare mentally for the confrontation ahead. Without realizing it, Patricia had arranged the ideal venue for exposing her lack of authority, gathering the entire neighborhood to witness a lesson in federal property law. She expected to face a defensive homeowner scrambling to justify so-called antisocial conduct. Instead, she would be met by a former federal investigator holding decades of experience and exhaustive proof of unauthorized decision-making. Sunday evening brought one final twist, a text message from Patricia herself. "Looking forward to tomorrow's discussion, Clayton. I trust you'll approach it with the same community spirit that makes our neighborhood exceptional." The forced friendliness failed to conceal the underlying warning, yet it also betrayed her enduring certainty in her position. I closed the